I want to move on to the REPO Act, which is one of the many bills contained in the fourth title, I believe. There is some concern expressed by senators during markup, senators who have experience, at least one senator in the banking industry, that this could affect the Treasury market for our own Treasuries. So if I understand correctly, if a Russian sovereign fund or Russian bank owns Treasuries that are here in the United States, we would be seizing those Treasuries. Is that correct?
Yes.
So, so here's the basis for the concern. So, we auction Treasuries occasionally. We have to issue new debt, unfortunately, to cover new expenditures that we haven't paid for, and also when old debt expires. And the concern is that when sovereign countries and sovereign wealth funds look at purchasing those Treasuries, if we actually consummate this REPO Act, that those countries will have less appetite for what was the most secure investment in the world, which is the U.S. Treasury. They may have less appetite for purchasing it, particularly if they're not an extremely close ally. If they end up on the bad list and their Treasury gets repoed, Mr. McCall, do you share that concern that this may affect the U.S. Treasury's ability to sell these financial instruments?
We've used this authority in the past, and the premise is essentially if you cause harm or injury, you essentially sort of waived your sovereign immunity, if you will, and so the assets that are frozen under sanctions are, as a result, can pay for the harm and injury that has been done by a country that is violating international law, which in this case I believe Russia is. And I'll be happy to get back to you on the more minutiae of this, but I would say overall, this is a very popular provision in this bill because what it says is essentially let Russia pay for its own war crimes, not the American taxpayer. These are seized Russian assets under international law, legally, and by law. We've done this before twice, where if a country causes that sort of harm or injury to another country and the assets are seized, and then they can be used for reparations. I think certainly once we get into Reconstruction, if we ever get there, that would be a wise use as well. I don't think most Americans out there want us using taxpayer dollars in any of this. They would prefer it to be from the Russian oligarchs and sovereign assets that have helped pay for Putin's war machine.
My concern is that we could end up costing the American taxpayers more because the cost of financing our debt could go up if we reduce the appetite for U.S. Treasuries when they go for auction. So I hope that's been factored into the cost. Now, this has been used in the past, but as I understand that, we were in conflict. We were engaged in direct conflict. This would be in Iraq, for instance, the Iraq-Kuwait War, and we used sort of United Nations Security Council plan to seize those assets, and they were used for victims of the Iraqi invasion in Kuwait. But the difference there is that we were directly involved in a military action with Iraq. And so I believe this would be the first time the United States has seized and repurposed frozen sanctioned assets owned by a foreign state, despite the absence of any direct military engagement.
I respectfully disagree that in two of those instances, the establishment of the Iran Claims Tribunal in 1981 and 1992, seizure of Iraqi assets for the transfer to the United Nations, the U.S. was not at war with the country whose assets were involved. And I believe that the Treasury market is very strong in the United States. I don't think this is going to have the dire warning impact that you think it would.
Again, in that circumstance, I believe it was the United Nations, and there was some I think, probably at least some comfort from the other countries that we didn't act unilaterally and we were acting with other countries, so we weren't acting arbitrarily toward one seizing and repurposing one country's assets. But here we're going alone. We're not doing it with a group of other countries or United Nations Security Council.
Yeah, we don't do this alone, by the way, and this is also supported by President Trump's former economic advisor and people like Newt Gingrich, people, I trust Trump's economic advisor more than some of the sideline, people trying to get in the game. He thinks it's a great idea.
Well, those are people I respect. I'm just the people who buy our treasuries may not respect Newt Gingrich as much as I do.
Well, but I think the former economic advisor of the president,
right? So
President Trump, he's in strong support of this. This has strong support across, bipartisan. Again, the underlying premise being, I think the Treasury market's going to be fine in the United States. I think that the underlying premise is, who do you want to pay for this?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm worried. I still have that concern. There may be bipartisan support here, but I think it sends a signal to the rest of the countries in the world that we just may take your treasuries. If you buy them from us, we may just take them back. And I think that's a little bit dangerous.
But we're not doing this. This is not, this is the EU, it's the United States. I mean, they're all involved in these sanctions. I guess you go back to the premise we have even sanctioned of these assets.
So one other concern that people have expressed in the REPO Act is that we would tie the hands of future president. That's a provision in this bill, I believe, that another president can't undo this. Would that be? Is that something the Democrats wanted in here so that Trump couldn't normalize relations later on?
I'm not concerned about what Mr. Trump would do. I'm concerned about what President Biden would do. And we want to ensure, just like with Nord Stream 2, when we sanctioned that pipeline of energy going from Russia into Europe, and we put a presidential waiver in there. And guess what? President Biden waived that sanction that Congress imposed, a mandatory sanction. And guess what? What came out of that? Europe became dependent on Russian energy. I never thought he would do it, but he did. And when you talk about the clock, the timetable of history, that was the first sign of weakness. And Afghanistan came after that. This was designed not for President Trump. In fact, President Trump is not going to be bound by this. If he doesn't want to be. I think it's good policy. And it was just really because of the history of this president, President Biden waiving congressional sanctions. And we didn't want him to disrespect the Congress again on this one.
So does or does it not bind future presidents?
I think that can be entertained in a future administration. We did this to tie President Biden's hands so he would have to do this, have to enforce it.
Right.
Because of the lack of trust from Nord Stream 2.
We haven't had much time to read these bills. I'm going on prior versions of the bill. So maybe I'm incorrect here, but I believe it does remove the president's ability to enter alter sanctions regime. Definitely. And my concern here is that could limit the president's negotiating leverage, and undermine the ability to come to some kind of peace deal in the Russia-Ukraine war. If he has to come back to Congress to undo the sanction.
I think my understanding from the legislature, once the conditions are met, then the obligation is completed.
And what are those conditions?
That these assets be used to pay for not only the efforts that we're undergoing today, but the reconstruction.
Well, I think so. That hasn't ameliorated my concerns, and other people still have this concern that we may have a change in the presidency at the end of this year, and that this conflict could still be going on, and that I understand the desire to keep the president from having a lot of wiggle room here, but it may be keeping him from having wiggle room in a direction that the next president needs to end a conflict.
Again, and I get your point. The intent was to bind the current president, current administration, based on the track record of not enforcing sanctions. I'll give you some other examples. Iran. He's not enforcing the energy sanctions. Iran has sold $80 billion to China that's funded their terror operations. The UN sanctions lapsed, and I have a bill to fix that and it's in this bill, on the missiles and drones that Iran is selling to Russia to kill Ukrainians. He's not enforcing that one. Why? Because they want to accommodate and appease Iran to get this Iran deal. Remember the hostage swap? That was a great one. 6 Iranian spies for 6 innocent civilians, and we paid them $6 billion. And then $10 billion of electricity they could sell into Iraq. And I mean, every time I turn around, they're cutting some deal with Iran to give more money. I don't trust them with sanctions. That's why it's not in here. It's not about President Trump. It's about binding this president. If you want me to write that in there, I will.
I think it'd be hard to write something depending on who wins the next election, but I think that does appeal to the Democrats, the fact that Trump's hands would be tied in this regard. And so another concern that I have, and I want to know if you have the same concern, is that there may be some retaliation that I believe the REPO Act, as is written here, only intends to seize assets, sovereign assets that are owned by the country, not private individuals of the country. But is it possible that U.S. assets in Russia could get seized as a retaliation to the REPO Act?
I don't believe so. And I think that, look, this right now we can only do what's seized in this country. When I talk to the NATO allies in the EU, the United States leads, and they will probably follow.